This is a review of Games Alcoholics Play, the analysis of life scripts written by Claude Steiner. I chose to review this particular book in spite of its age. It was written in 1968 and published in paperback in 1971, because in it, Dr. Steiner described one of the more influential definitions of addiction and treatment, considered an alternative to the common disease model proposed by AA. Dr. Steiner applied what he called transactional analysis to alcoholism and, through that study, to emotional disorders in general. Steiner defines addiction not as a progressive disease, but as symptomatic of a series of related conscious decisions, scripts, with a predictable, often self-destructive course. Treatment for addiction, using this theoretical basis, involves identifying the games and roles involved, then interpreting the script, having the players change their roles, allowing, or more accurately forcing, the client to make new and healthier choices. Read, play a better game to win the same kind of payoffs. Transactional, or often sometimes called structural analysis, in spite of it being considered a form of classic Freudian psychoanalysis, a paradigm used very little in addiction treatment today, understanding transactional analysis is still important in three ways. First, it's the basis of concepts that have become part of our common language. For example, the idea of a stroke in interpersonal relationships, such as a compliment, a touch, or just paying attention. Another is the idea of an inner child. As is typical of such ideas, the common concept isn't what Dr. Steiner or Dr. Byrne, the psychiatrist who coined the concept of transactional analysis in the first place, meant. The doctors described the child as one of three basic roles or ego states people will play in social interactions: the child, the adult, or the parent. The common lexicon has the child as an almost different person inside of each adult, battling to get out into the world. It's a lot more like Freud's id versus the ego. For the two doctors with transactional analysis, what they were talking about were only states of the ego. They have ignored the id and the superego, because for them, what they were looking for were behaviors that one can actually measure and see. Those are only ego states. The second thing talking about transactional analysis and why it's important is that it's one of the few important theories about treating human behavior that arose in the 60s and 70s that defined addiction as a choice and not a disease. As such, it explained why people can so often find recovery without treatment, why they started in the first place, and why they relapse later. It allowed for hope in treatment, something that AA's view very badly lacks. And the third reason TA was important in something like this is that it's one of the first theories of treatment that required a viewing of a client's behavior within the environment or social context. As such, it gave the therapist and family guidelines for treatment that could work without years of training and were based on observable behaviors, something that psychoanalysis ignored. The basic concepts of TA include that most behavior between people is a replaying of scripts or predictable patterns intended to result in a predictable outcome. Dr. Steiner suggested that all scripts are initially created in childhood and are based on core beliefs that each person derives about him or herself from the environment and especially from parents. In the case of addicts, he suggested that most people learned they were of little value or even deserving of punishment. While everyone develops an idea of their value in childhood and many feel they're worthless, not all who do choose an addictive script in response. The reason for the script is to earn payoffs or emotional strokes in such a manner that it reinforces what the person already knows about themselves. The child who believes himself a hero will do heroic things in front of witnesses. The child who believes he's worthless will likewise sabotage his own happiness, proving to other people how worthless he believes he is. A script becomes a game when there's a difference between the core beliefs the players hold about each other, and when there's some value placed on the reinforcers or payoffs for those behaviors. In another way of putting it, it becomes a game if it's a competition between I believe I'm worthless, you believe I'm worth something, and I'm going to prove it to you. When I do, I win the game. Dr. Steiner identified these three types of alcoholic people, or alcoholic scripts, based on the scripts they use to maintain their addiction. Every alcoholic will use a variation of each of these scripts. They all use all the scripts that are available, but they will in turn return to the one that's most successful and most comfortable with their own self-definitions. The three scripts he identified were the drunk and proud, and the roles involved with that script are the rebel, the persecutor, and the patsy. The person who drinks is a rebel. He's being told he's not allowed to do something like drink. He'll hide the alcohol. He'll go out and party without permission. He's then persecuted by someone telling him how bad he is, which proves to everyone the bad person that the drinker actually believes himself to be. And then there will be the patsy, the person who was convinced that the rebel won't do it again. I'm sorry, I'm a good person at heart, I'm really going to try. And then, haha, I've gone out and drunk and screw you, you were wrong. The next script that Dr. Steiner identified was called the lush. The roles in this particular game are the lonely victim, or the lush. Again, a persecutor, a rescuer, a patsy, and a connection, a personal connection. In this role play, the primary concept is that the person drinks because they're lonely and they're a victim of their loneliness. And so they have to have a connection with someone else. There's a persecutor who holds that person down, who makes them continue in their lonely life. But then that person becomes rescued. And this doesn't last forever. They keep going back to their drinking habits. That's where the person who becomes a patsy is involved. And then there's the connection, the person who can actually be the reason that they're getting through the day. That can either be a drinking partner or the person who rescues them and keeps them away from drinking, at least for a short time. The last script that the doctor identified is called the wino. In this is a sick child. This is a person who's made ill by their drinking or ill by the world, and they have to drink because they feel sick. Again, there's a rescuer and a connection. The thing to remember about these roles is that it's not necessary that there be an individual person for each individual role. One person can have several roles, and as you play the game, most people will change their roles depending on what's going on at the moment, what the payoffs might be at that particular moment. So only 2 people can be involved in a game that has 4 or 5 roles, but you can see them changing their roles as they go through the process of the game. You can see the payoffs being made as they continue and go back and forth. All people have scripts that they need to play out. It's hard to find people to cooperate with dysfunctional games like these, and that's the reason why there's codependence, because everybody's playing a script, everybody's looking for payoffs, everybody's just a little bit off, and so sometimes there's the need to keep the drinking person drinking. That's a part of the idea of the roles and the games and the scripts. Therapy, therefore, requires first that there be a contract between the person who's trying to get better and the therapist. Without that commitment to actually quit drinking, not diminish their drinking, but quit, without that commitment, the therapist actually becomes a patsy, becomes a player in the game. You've just reinforced the need for the script. That's unusual in transactional analysis at the time in the 70s because they were talking about drinking socially as appropriate, where over-drinking is alcoholism, and so a lot of therapy was based on the idea of not helping a person stop drinking, but rather reduce their drinking and look at their root cause, why they were getting into it in the first place, as the only reason to get into therapy. And Dr. Steiner felt that that was not effective. That was not the way to treat the addiction, because what you're doing is reinforcing the script that helps cause the addiction in the first place. Further talking about therapy, Steiner recommended that group therapy is more important than individual therapy because it's the interaction between people, the transactions, transactional analysis. It's the transactions and interactions between people that are important. And so you must have therapy in groups or in therapeutic communities for that person to practice new roles, new games, new scripts to get away from the old ones that were dysfunctional. It gives you opportunities for all kinds of learning, things that you can't do in individual therapy. Treatment, therefore, involves identifying the scripts that the client uses, the payoffs that they're trying to get in their games, and identifying better, more healthy ways to get similar payoffs using different kinds of scripts. It also involves interrupting the script or interrupting the pattern in play. So, for example, when the person has identified someone else as a potential patsy, making sure that person knows to stand up. So a family is as important in therapy as individuals or people who attend group. And again, this was unusual in transactional analysis. In conclusion, when you're talking about Claude Steiner's work, it's easy to get distracted by the potentially offensive statements he makes in the book. And you have to remember, he would write things like, the wino script is often used by old homosexuals, or Alcoholics develop their scripts in childhood because of their mothers. It's offensive and it's inappropriate and it's wrong. And taken in context, this was written in the 50s, 60s, and 70s by a man who was classically trained in Freudian psychotherapy, arguably at the time the most dysfunctionally prejudiced era in modern American history. If you take him out of context and look at the work that he did for its own value, get away from those kinds of judgments, you'll find that there's a lot of important things to take from transactional analysis, not least of which is the idea that his work is an evolutionary stage in the development of psychiatry itself. Between Freudian psychoanalysis and modern behaviorist theories that we have now, this was a transition where he was talking about things like measurable behaviors that are important in treatment, as opposed to looking at the id and the ego, even though he still talked about ids, egos, and superegos, about dream analysis and things like that from old Freudian psychoanalysis. What was more important, though, is that in his work, behavior itself wasn't observed in isolation, but in context, in relationships and the environment, an extraordinarily important and powerful concept nearly every therapist today uses. Dr. Steiner also presented his work as something that lay people can learn and use for themselves without the expertise of doctors. This flies in the face of psychoanalysis, where you're therapated, where you sit on the couch and they fix you. In this case, in the work that he was writing, and the fact that this book, while written in a very sort of academic way with references and citations and written kind of dryly, it was intended in paperback format for people to read for themselves and for their families. So you can do the work that's recommended yourself, your family can take part, and you can heal yourself from a dysfunctional disorder rather than a disease. And that's a hopeful thing that was not possible in theoretical courses in the past. A couple of the things when you're talking about using his work specifically that I would take into my treatment in the future. When the work I do would involve working with people with addictions, one of the most important is the idea that he drew a distinction between withdrawal panic, which is the mental idea of I'm going to go through withdrawal, and now what do I do? I have to go back to drink so I avoid the problem. He drew a distinction between that and withdrawal sickness, which is the actual physical illness one feels when going through withdrawal. One of the things he pointed out is the withdrawal sickness, the physical illness, is considerably less powerful than the withdrawal panic and lasts a considerably shorter time. And so you have to prepare people who are going through treatment for the withdrawal panic and help them develop coping mechanisms for that specific issue as a separate and distinct concept. I would also take forward the idea that group therapy and therapeutic communities are more powerful than individual treatment, and that would be a core part of any of the work that I did with anyone in addictions. I also like the idea of scripts and hidden payoffs when they're as useful targets for changes in behavior, because one of the things I've noticed is people have predictable patterns of behavior that if you point them out and interrupt the pattern, people have an opportunity to learn a new behavior and heal from the ills. And the last thing I would take that would be most important is that there are no secret techniques in the work that he described, and that people can do the work themselves, for themselves, and with their families on their own, without some expert telling them this is how to get better. You can get better on your own. Thank you.